Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon on EP Reach Out. I'm really excited to be here to host our first book launch, which is fantastic. So I'm going to hand over to one of the editors, Christopher Arnold, and he'll start us off this afternoon. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Sarah. And please, everybody, Christopher is such a mouthful. Just stick with Chris. Everyone calls me Chris, except my wife. And that's when I'm naughty. So let's stick with Chris, shall we? It's a great pleasure. I think it's entirely appropriate that this week we choose to launch this particular book, because if I remember right, it's almost exactly 2 years ago since we went into lockdown. And it was such a remarkable event that I felt it needed recording. And 3 conversations triggered an interest in putting this book together. They were both, all 3 were conversations with parents. 2 of them had got children who were at school, at university, and had to come home because of the restrictions. And both of these parents told extraordinary tales about the changes they had to make in their lives to accommodate living with basically a young adult. The third is a parent of a young man, also about, I think he was about 18, with a known disability. And again, the response of that young man to the lockdown was really quite unpredicted. I would have anticipated difficulties, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. So I want to say, first of all, thanks to those parents who triggered this. I had a conversation with the publisher, Christina, who you'll meet a little bit later. And she casually said that she'd quite like a book on COVID and children. And my first response was, no way, Jose, I'm all booked out. I've been seen done. I'm trying to hang up my word processor or whatever. But the following day, I thought, actually, this could be quite an interesting project. And I have to confess, to my delight, so it has turned out. It has been, in the main, a fascinating project to undertake. And in particular, I want to thank all the people who've given their time and given their words to this. Nobody is receiving a penny from this. All the royalties are going to a children's charity, Alder Hay. And it's been a pleasure working with a new co-editor, Brian Davis. Now, sadly, Brian can't be with us today. He's at a meeting. He has a proper job, and he can't be with us. But he has recorded a kind of an introduction. So I'm going to ask Sarah if we can get that recording up. Sarah, is that possible?
Yeah, I'll get that started now, Chris.
Let's go for it. So this is Brian Davis. He's my co-editor. He's also my boss, as it turns out, at the Tavistock. He's the course director for the Educational Psychology Training course at the Tavistock Portman NHS Trust. And that's where he is at the moment.
So just checking in with my things. Here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the official launch of the book, Children in Lockdown, Learning the Lessons of Pandemic Times. I'm Dr. Brian Davis, and I am the course director for the Essex University validated Educational Psychology Training course at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust. Chris Arnold and I are very pleased to be editors of this book and also contributors to the content alongside some wonderful colleagues. Contributors have provided their incredibly useful insights, both in understanding the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the populations they are close to, and in their work with children and families in times of great crisis. Any fees that would be payable to the contributors are to be directed to Alder Hay Children's Charity. This charity supports innovative and progressive medical care and treatment for children facing significant health and development challenges. We wish to acknowledge the support from Christine Weath-Perry and the team from Carnac Books, our publishers. Their mission to publish seminal and contemporary texts which include a focus on psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic principles. We owe gratitude to tutors on our educational psychology courses, educational psychologists who have recently graduated and those more experienced, and the other contributing professionals, including teachers, social workers, and early support managers. In particular, I must mention Southend Educational Psychology Service. They have not only majorly contributed to the book, but they are also making this event happen. However, much bigger than that, Southend Educational Psychology Service, reacting to the stimulus of the pandemic, have taken major strides in contributing to the community of practice of educational psychology. For example, through their Educational Psychology Outreach Initiative. Check out the incredible video and other resources in the digital library on YouTube. A wonderful example of giving psychology away for the benefit of many. More than anyone else, we owe thanks to children, parents and carers who have allowed a light to be shed on their thoughts and experiences. Why this book? Why now? We felt that it was very important to give a voice to children and young people, parents, carers and professionals, so that we could begin to record and understand the individual and cumulative effects and the impact and consequences of the pandemic, including those of lockdown, on our populations. Furthermore, it seemed important to try and identify and isolate any learning that could be gained from this exceptional and often referred to as unprecedented time. Although undoubtedly a major critical incident with major negative impact, what shines through in the writing is a sense of hope and optimism and examples of adaptability and flexibility. There is much to learn from examining our complex human responses to adversity. We consider the context and nature of this modern pandemic relative to earlier pandemics in our history. There is an international perspective gained through looking across the UK, Ireland and Europe, Singapore, South Africa and the USA. In particular, the differential impact of the COVID pandemic is highlighted, for example, by ethnicity, socio-economic grouping and location. The impact on all children, but especially vulnerable children, including those with special educational needs or disabilities, mental health needs, those in care or seeking asylum are explored. In this book, we set the context and learn from children, social workers, teachers, parents and psychologists. In part, we consider organisational responses to the problems faced. There is a chapter which helps us think about how consultation models of practice can link with an understanding of people in organisations and the emotional aspects revealed to us through the application of psychodynamic theory. This is linked with the implementation of organisational change frameworks. This kind of thinking and process, I believe, can really help in highly emotionally charged situations where people's differing perceptions need to be acknowledged and difficult decisions need to be made, so inaction can be avoided and appropriate actions can be supported. In summarising our learning at the end of the book, we by no means provide all the answers for dealing with the difficult questions that might arise from reflecting on the experiences. However, we do feel there are lessons to be learned for ourselves, our services and strategists to help us anticipate, resource and reduce the impact of such large-scale critical incidents. This book might have something for everyone. As one reviewer has said, this accessible and scholarly book invites new thinking. It should have wide appeal for teachers, psychologists, social workers, parents and carers, and anyone wanting to help children to flourish. I do hope you enjoy listening to our contributors today. Also, check out the discount available to you as a thank you for attending the session. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Brian. I thank him in person, and I will when I next see him. We'd now like to move on to the publishers. Christina Whitch-Perry has been establishing Carnac, I think Confer Carnac, in London, and this is now the second volume that we've produced with them, the first being a book on psychodynamic approaches in educational psychology, which has turned out very well and been reviewed very nicely too. So Christina, can we bring you in here? And perhaps you'd like to share your perspective of producing this book with this group of people.
Hello, everyone. It's a delight really to be able to participate in this book launch party here. And I've heard now that it is the first book launch that EP Reach Out has hosted, so that's exciting as well. And I think Chris and Brian have said quite a lot of the things that I would have said, so I don't actually have to speak for very long, which is always a relief. But I did want to show you the first book that Chris and I collaborated on, which is, he's just mentioned, Learning from the Unconscious. And this is what started our relationship actually quite early on in the sort of relaunch of Karnak books. The history of this publishing house is quite interesting. Karnak Books was always very closely associated, at least geographically, with the Tavistock, and was a bookshop that specialized in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and also published books in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. In 2016, towards the end of 2016, the entire book list and all of its contents, authors, existing books, and commission titles was sold to Routledge. Many of you may be familiar with Routledge. And so the remaining Karnak and the bookshop and the list was then bought by Confer Limited, which is the parent company for Karnak Books. And so, sort of like a phoenix out of the ashes, we've recreated Karnak Books as a home for publishing in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and now educational psychology. And I'm very pleased that the collaboration has continued with, of course, the new book, Children in Lockdown, which you can see clearly here on my screen. And we are offering a discount. If you go to the Karnak Bookshop website and put in Lockdown 25, you can get a 25% discount. And I did just want to follow up on what Chris had mentioned at the very beginning about talking to parents and people having to adjust to no school, which was a big shock for all of us parents when that happened in, yes, almost exactly 2 years ago now, in March of 2020. And it was my daughter who came home from university and basically told me that I have no business telling her what to do or how to behave or when to get up or when to study. And of course, that was a bit of a shock for me as a mother, to be told that actually now I'm grown up and I would be at university, so please leave me alone. And so that was one of the things that started me thinking about how we really need to reflect on the impact that the lack of schooling for so many millions of students around the globe has had, and how this will affect us in all sorts of different ways going forward into the future. And hopefully, as Brian has also mentioned, we will be able to take those appropriate actions and those good practices that developed out of this period and make things better going forward. And I hope that's what this book will do. Just on a final note, we have sent a copy of this to Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner UK. So we hope that she will take notice and help us publicise this good work. So I think I'll let the rest of the team continue, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Christina. That's lovely. And thank you for acknowledging that it was actually you and your daughter that was part of the pairs. I think one of the other drivers is that although pandemics have been with us for 2,500 years, very few have been within living memory. And the extraordinary changes that we've all had to make, may get forgotten when we move on to the next thing. 2 years ago, when Christina and I started talking about this, the next big thing was probably going to be climate change. We never anticipated the Ukrainian situation, but it would be very sad if the stories and the experiences of the last 2 years during the time of the pandemic got lost. And that is one of the risks. When you go through a very difficult time, many people just want to move on. So for me, this book acts as a kind of record, a sort of library of people's experiences and what we can learn from them. I'd now like to move on to, Brian was mentioned the extraordinary work of the Southend Educational Psychology Service. And I think every educational psychology service had to scratch around and say, you know, how do we basically work face to face with children? How do we deliver a service to our clients and parents, children, teachers, without physically being able to meet them? And the service that seems to have been most innovative of this is the Southend service, under the leadership of Anne. So I'd like to hand over to them now, please, because they created something that they call EP Reach Out. It is extraordinary. It's a rich source of information and ideas and wisdom about applications of psychology to children, young people, parents, and teachers. So can I hand over now to the Southend service? That's Anne Powell-Davies, Sarah Sivers, Nicole Schnackenberg. I think that's the list for now, isn't it? Have I got that right? Good.
For the moment.
Okay, thanks very much. Off you go.
Okay, if I could just start very briefly by thanking my colleagues, Sarah and Nicole, for coming up with the idea that was EP Reach Out and bringing it as a proposal to say, what can we do as we're no longer able to go out to schools on that fateful first week, I think it was, as we went into lockdown. Energized, motivated, passionate to make a difference. They offered that proposal and we just had to make it happen. So by, thankfully, our local authority being very lithe and agile, it allowed us to move forward with Reach Out and subsequently start to do some work around research, which we'll talk about separately later. So colleagues, thank you so much, and over to you a little.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for supporting the project right from day one. It was lovely to hear Brian's warm words as well about EP Reach Out. And in fact, the chapter in the book written by the three of us is about the journey of setting up EP Reach Out, making that proposal, that very frightening, I think I can say, first webinar going live, wondering, will the tech work? Will anyone turn up? Will it be useful? Most importantly, with this real desire to borrow a concept from Etienne Wenger, who we reference in the book, with a real desire to create a community of practice, to draw together ideas, understandings from across the globe. And I think it was the second or the third week we had an educational psychologist, Deborah Mainwaring, from Australia, so truly from across the globe, and connect with, reach out to, support children, young people and families, really opening our hearts and minds to what they would wish for, privileging particularly what young people would wish for. And something that really stands out for me is a request from a young person to have something on singing and mental health. And the three of us thinking, gosh, who do we know that can talk about singing and mental health? And in the end, because we did not want to not offer something that had been requested, myself giving it a whirl. And I think many times it was people giving it a whirl, using perhaps the webinar function in that way for the first time, a lot of nerves and anticipation. And yet something really wonderful grew from it. And that journey is all charted there in that chapter in Children in Lockdown.
Yes, I think you kind of touch on it there as well, Nicole, that, you know, part of our chapter as well, it's around communities of practice, which is, you know, what we based it on. And, you know, EP Reach Out wouldn't have been what it is now if we hadn't have had the community of EPs, not just in Southend, but sort of across the country, across the world, sort of join us and really kind of see the value in sharing their work at a time where we really all did feel kind of quite isolated and uncertain. As Anne said, you know, what were we going to do? You know, we couldn't go out to schools. We couldn't even leave our own homes. So there was very much a passion to kind of get out there and do something. But for it to really have meaning. And I think, you know, we're now almost 2 years down the line and we're still doing these weekly webinars, which and having people wanting to come on board, both educational psychologists, but we've widened out. We welcome health professionals, we welcome people from a wide range of educational backgrounds to come and talk to us. And, you know, that's what we wanted to achieve. And I think that really shines through the chapter as well, that we started this off, but we couldn't have done it without all of the people that came along to present for us and watch us, all the attendees and everything like that. So we do feel we're sort of privileged to have created a real community of practice. And yeah, it has been a real privilege to write the chapter as well and have that contribution there in black and white in such an amazing book. So yeah, really special.
And to use Reach Out as a platform for our families, for our parents, and for our young people to also present has been a lovely, fantastic opportunity.
So yeah, so please take advantage of the code and buy the book. Chris, we'll pass back on to you after that advertisement.
Thank you.
Merciless advertisement, yeah. Hey, look, thanks, that's lovely. And I have to emphasize, it is a remarkable resource. There's nothing like it on the web anywhere. So go and have a look. That's what I do from time to time. One of the challenges, I think, in particular, was for children who have some kind of behavioral or emotional or social sort of difficulty, who may well have been being educated in a much smaller environment, such like a pupil referral unit. And being locked down with troubled children is surely one of the most challenging events that a parent might have to face. And we were very fortunate to have at the Tavistock a research student it's interested in this. So she went out and started interviewing parents in these circumstances. Sadly, she can't be with us today, but her supervisor is Richard, and Richard and I'm embarrassed. What was it? Come on, Richard. Who is it?
Emily Barrett.
Emily,
so Emily Barrett did the main part of the research.
Sorry, sorry, Emily, you'll be watching this. But we're delighted to have Richard. Richard co-authored the chapter with Emily, and I'd like to hand over. So we're talking about being locked down with troubled children. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I will talk to Emily's work, but actually it's really the participants that we found from 3 families who wanted to describe their experiences of that lockdown period. And a lot of my chapter that I put together with Emily was around actually, what are they saying? What are they telling us around that experience? And what we found from them was such a strength of emotion and strength of situation. I'll just read a little bit as I plug the book. For Liz, when she described it, and I'm just thinking, oh, thank God he's asleep now. As soon as he's with me, I can't do anything. He's more of a hindrance. Well, I love him to pieces. And then I say something to him like that. And then I remember, and I think, don't say that. That's what your mother used to say. Don't even think it. Bite your tongue. And that's where Emily's research really took to a different place when we started to hear the experiences of these mothers who are in a position of not just being parents, but also then asked to be teachers of these young people who have been a struggle to educate in mainstream. So the push for them to try and not miss out on the curriculum that they've already missed out on caused such a tension. And there was such a strength of emotion that was described that we have in the chapter. There's a key, and we have some diagrams that show parts. It became represented as trees, where actually parts of the lockdown experience is just the leaves, which could have been just the focus of her thesis, and that would have been enough. But actually, what we came to realize was that there was so much more behind these stories that they were talking about. And just in that little quote, you can hear that tension, that what is it that's underneath? What are the roots causing? What is it that we have that is actually impacting around those parents thinking about, well, what about my parental experiences? And I think that that's something that we've heard from other sources, but we particularly heard from these parents in terms of that reflection on, well, what was my relationship with my parents like, and how am I managing that now with my child? Because the experiences of these three was of suffocating of forced proximity, of having to people in positions where they didn't want to, and also around actually that point where they started to go, okay, we have a change in our relationship here that is to try and hold different roles. But each of them got to a point of actually they were playing and playmates for their children and became the child at times, as the child ended up holding control and being the parent with them. And we saw that shift with them. And that's where actually a colleague asked me about, well, isn't the kind of conclusion of this book basically that lockdown's bad for children? I was like, well, there's a bit more to it, because each of these parents described an intense push and pull experience, something where actually there was a love-hate relationship where the children would say, you're the best mum in the world, and I wish you'd never given birth to me, within the space of 10 minutes, and would actually got to a real place of closeness and development in those relationships. I noticed there was a question around what do we think about in terms of attachment aspects, but actually there's something that is still unclear in terms of the impact of that longer term, because these parents and these young people now have a different relationship to what it was before. And I think that links in with how we saw Jennifer's chapter is really nice in chapter 9, that talks about actually how you get back into school. And actually I think that that Messio and microsystem is how that happened for them. But actually Abby's going to speak a bit later about actually she talked about an emotion coaching model, which one of my parents started to use, because they had, most of them were single parents. One of them had 3 in the parental family group, and actually they had to work with each other and they had to do that problem solve together, which I think if she'd had that model, she would have really enjoyed, to feel that confidence, because it waned. Our final person I will just read to describe something that I thought was very nice, because actually she got to the point of thinking in the future, well, there's just too much negativity in this world. And actually there's so much craziness. If everyone could just do what they're supposed to do as human beings, be nice to each other and do the right thing, I think we'd be better off in the long run. Shall we leave as the thought for my little introduction to my chapter as we reflect on other aspects in the world at the moment. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Richard. That's lovely. And I have to so agree with you that there's been an awful lot of awfulizing around the pandemic. And I, for one, have actually lost a friend. A friend of mine died of COVID. And obviously that's very tragic. And there are things we can learn to make this a better world. And as we've learned, and you'll see documented in chapter 1, some good things come after pandemics. Some improvements do come. But more of that by reading the book. Okay, we'd like to move on now to another video. One of the contributors is called Xavier Elequin. I hope I've pronounced his name correctly. And he's somebody I've worked with before on the previous book for Karnak, the book Learning from the Unconscious. Dale Bartlett and myself edited that and contributed chapters to that. And he happened to have 2 children. He and his wife had 2 children, one of whom came home from university and one of them stayed. And he very kindly has asked his second son, the one who stayed home, to contribute an offering for this book launch. So if I can ask Sarah to prepare that second video, that would be lovely. Are you there, Sarah?
Yes, I am. I'm just getting it up now, Chris.
Thanks.
Sorry, I'm just going to start. Could you see that playing, Chris?
No, I can't.
Okay.
I can see the menu of the files.
Sorry, bit of a glitch here. Just going to try again with getting up.
If you want, we could move on to the next contributor and come back to this.
Let me just have one more go with it. It worked a minute ago.
Okay.
Yes, let's have one more chance, and then we might have to do it at the end because I'm not quite sure why it's not coming up. No. Can we go on to the next one? Sorry, Chris.
Of course. We'll come back to Zav and Caleb when we get the technology to work. But I'd like to introduce a different professional group now, some social workers. Social work has, again, like educational psychology, had to adapt radically to the constraints of a lockdown. And I'm delighted to introduce Tim Fisher and Becca Dove. I think it's just the two of you, isn't that right, Becca and Tim? Yeah, I think.
In fact, we've got Richard Devine with us. Perhaps okay. Becca hasn't made it on the call.
Okay, Richard, your name on the screen is Becca Dove. I don't know if you can change that. But I'd like to introduce Richard and Tim, who are from Camden, and again have contributed the chapter which shows a very innovative practice in social work. And I have to say I'm extremely excited and very honoured to have you as part of this team. So can I hand over to you, Tim and Richard?
Sure, thanks very much. I mean, it was a real honour for us to be part of this project, and it was Sarah originally that linked us in, so we're really appreciative of that. I should say that Rich works in Bath and North East Somerset rather than Camden, but Becca Dove, our other contributor, works with me in Camden, and our chapter, as Chris said, is about social work, is about families, the stories of families, social work and the lockdown. And we started our chapter with Aristotle, and Aristotle saying that the more isolated that he became, the more he was reliant on stories. And on the cusp of the lockdown, we developed a practice of sharing a human story of social work, a story of relational practice once a week over the local authority email, that proprietorial space, which usually is full of policies and tumbleweed. We decided to drop a story in once a week on a Friday. And so this chapter was a really nice opportunity for us to draw together some of those stories and look at the themes and what we felt was happening for children, families and social workers during the pandemic. And there were some themes there around stories as glue, stories of loss and stories of mutuality. I don't know, Rich, which theme you wanted to pitch in on. I'll give you a bit of thinking time and say that the story that I remember in particular was Mona, who's a social worker. I'm in the office today in Camden, in King's Cross, and the office is open all the way through the pandemic, and social workers have had to get out into the community right the way through. So there hasn't been a lockdown for social workers in terms of being in the community and trying to make sure that children are safe. And the story that features in the book with Mona is working with a family who'd recently come from Bangladesh. So while the world wasn't moving, while the world was stuck in lockdown and suffering the coronavirus, this was a mobile family that were refugees from Bangladesh, and tragically this woman fleeing violence there had managed to bring her older daughter, but her little baby was stuck in Bangladesh, and the social worker, Mona, that was working with her, described really vividly meeting this woman and her older daughter in the community, wearing all the PPE and the face masks and everything, and meeting and trying to really support the family and help them and check in and make sure that that they were all safe and well and had what they needed in temporary accommodation. But also the social work was really doing the hard yards to try and deliver documents to the solicitors and trying to work hard on getting the little baby back and reunifying that family group. And we hear a lot about social work and the necessity of removing children, but a lot of the work of social work is based on trying to develop, protect, help relationships and family groups. And so it's nice to feature a story like that. But yeah, Rich, what was your feeling about the book and the project, and was there a story that caught your eye that you remember particularly?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, just because I'm mindful of the time. And but one of the stories that stuck out for me was one where there was a child protection case conference, and they were trying to facilitate a hybrid meeting, and the conference chair was having some real difficulty getting the technology to work. And these two young brothers who were part of the conference, deciding whether they were at risk of significant harm, kind of chipped in and helped the chair. And there was something about the collapsing of traditional roles that cultivated a kind of different type of relationship. And so that was what COVID brought us, as well as the difficulties and the challenges, was opportunities for a different kind of intimacy. And that came through on a lot of the stories.
That's a nice one, Rich. And it wasn't that element of, like what you said there about the intimacy and the mutuality as well. And we always are trying to be human and work relationally. But COVID sometimes put people in situations where that was a real necessity. And there's a lovely one about a local laundrette where the residents of a temporary accommodation shelter grouped together and co-produced a laundry service, which was another nice story. So we'll leave you with that one, and thank you again for inviting us to contribute both to the book and this wonderful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Richard. That was great. I have to say, partly because I'm an ed psych, not a social worker, I found your chapter completely fascinating, very, very different from certainly my own experiences. Can we try again for the tape of Zav and Caleb, Sarah?
Yes, we certainly can. Apologies to Zav when he watches this back that we had a bit of a glitch the first time, but we should have him loud and clear now.
Just a reminder, Zav, he's an ed psych. I've collaborated with him on previous projects. He's got 2 children, and here he goes.
Hello, I'm Dr. Zav Eloquin. I wrote chapter 6 in this book that we're celebrating, Lockdown and the Family Reflections of a Psychologist. And I have with me to help me out one of the inspirations of the chapter, my youngest son, Caleb. Hello. Caleb, thank you. That's right. Okay, son, you've read this book. Mm-hmm. You're part of this family, so you're an expert. Yeah. What was your experience of lockdown?
Having Jacob come home was
the oldest brother from university.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting to see how that affected the family and how everything shifted when he came home, because he was still in the same mindset as he was at university. And
I'll just add to that he came I think he came on one of the last flights out of Berlin, where he was on exchange, isolated for a bit just in case, and came home and thought he'd still carry on his university mode of life. So the first few days, there was a bit of tension in the family about how we were going to manage that.
Yeah, and it was ultimately a nice thing to happen back. But also the schooling was substandard. It was just task after task of all of these endless things to do, and there was no real gratification for it. And that was definitely a bad thing.
Okay, what do you mean by gratification? Say a bit more.
Well, you submit a task and that's it. You never see it again. No marking. No.
So it's like pointless, really.
Yeah, really. Pointless.
And I was really struck by that, because I was trying to sort of, wanted you to have an education. I was trying to get you up, and sometimes I was letting you lie in, and I just saw task after task pile up in your inbox, and it just seemed a bit depressing, really. It was stressful. I remember. Yeah. Okay, I share that. Nice for that. You read the chapter. Thank you. I wonder, what was the effect of reading about us as a family?
Well, with some hindsight, we can see that it really did bring us together. It was tough. It was a tough experience, and that brings people together in general. And having the family as a whole was one of the best things that we could have done whilst doing that. And also how really you depicted my experience in school very well. And
thank you.
That's a nice thing to see that someone actually understood what we were going through. And that was a good thing.
I was interested. I didn't ask him to say that. But yeah, I was really struck by that. And I think, writing it made me review. You just don't realize what's going on when you're living it, but to review it and to see all these sort of subtle changes, almost like chapters in a book, as we made sense of lockdown, worked out how to live together, different sort of bedtimes, people getting up different times of the day and night, but we did it. And yeah, whilst there were some difficult times, I remember, like you, some of the really special times. That sunrise, that when we were on the scooters, that's not in this chapter, but we just drove down this main road on scooters with the sun rising in front of us, and the world was so quiet. And I just thought, this is great. We'll never have that again. That was really special. So to write about it, I think helped me capture some of the sort of love, the real sort of love that I have for you guys. So that was good. I like that. Last question then, what impacts has COVID had on you and us as a family going forwards? We've got a couple, yeah.
Well, I think, as I said, it did bring us together. It kind of gave us a more single-minded view of everything, because it was kind of us against the world, against COVID. And that was interesting to see, but to be mindful of it as well was important. And definitely at school, it was a big impact on me, not being able to see friends outside. That definitely deeply affected me as well as everybody else in my school. And I really saw that it did stunt some people's growth as a person. I saw some kids that were just not socializing properly, and that's very sad to see. But I feel like as a whole we've become better people because of it.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good news. And I think, yeah, we're definitely closer as a family. So thank you.
Sounds right.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
I thought that was lovely. It's the first time I've seen that. And it's nice, particularly nice to have the views of a child speak for themselves, which brings us very neatly on to the next contribution. The largest questionnaire response about the impact of COVID and lockdown children was conducted by the Southend Educational Psychology Service. And what I'd like to do now is to introduce Kate, Sarah, Lauren, and the other Sarah to talk about their findings from a huge, monumental survey, which is the results of which are expressed in the book. They're also available in other places, but it really is an incredible piece of work. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Chris. As you just so kindly introduced, we did put out this survey because we really wanted to hear our children and young people's voices. There were so many narratives around about the pandemic, about what was happening, all these big life changes that everyone was adapting to, but yet the voices of our children and young people just seem to be missing. And as educational psychologists, that's something we are very passionate about. We love to hear the stories, the voices, and their experiences. And we took that, well, Sarah very kindly put that out to us, and we all jumped on board saying, yes, this is something that we want to do. We want to hear their voices. We want to know their experiences, because it's such an important part of the story, which is how it started. And I think I'll pass on to someone else to carry it on, really.
Thank you, Sarah. I completely agree. I think, especially listening to Caleb there when he was saying, you really captured my experience. I could feel myself smiling, because I was thinking back to when we were feeling quite overwhelmed, really, all these responses coming in, and we had that wonderful moment where we all said, these children and young people really want us to hear their thoughts. They really want to get their points across, and we really want to get their points across in their words. And it just felt so exciting and just amazing, and a privilege to be able to do that. And I think what stuck out for me, and that we explore more in the chapter, was perhaps we did a bit of awfulizing as well. That's been brought up a few times, and we expected it to be quite hard, and it was quite hard, some of the things that we were reading about missed opportunities and things like that. But I'll always remember we're taken by surprise, really, because we had so many responses about opportunities missed out on but also gained through COVID, and we just weren't quite expecting that to be such a strong theme to come through. And that I always remember quotes about I've actually really enjoyed going into school because I've worked with people that I wouldn't usually see because the year groups were merged. Children saying, I'm being outside more, I'm really enjoying being outside. I know for me personally, and a lot of members of our team, to hear children say, I feel really privileged and I'm really enjoying going outside and having that space and that time and doing different things, that made me really appreciate my garden. I think we had one quote saying, I don't have a garden, so going for walks and doing this, or going into school for the children that did, I've really enjoyed that and made the most of it. That made me get out into my garden and really appreciate what I had around me. I think that was kind of the theme of our chapter, wasn't it? Look at these wonderful things that we can learn from children's experiences, and from their actual words, I think was just so powerful. And again, like you, Sarah, I could go on and on. So I am going to pass to somebody else to have their say, because I think we could talk about these themes forever, as we have done on multiple webinars and podcasts and all of those things, because we just wanted to keep getting that pupil voice out there. So I'll pass over to someone else.
Yeah, I think you put that so well, Lauren. There was just so much for us to learn as well, and actually it just felt like such an important project, and the views were so sort of precious. It really felt like a responsibility to sort of do something with them, and so we have worked really hard to sort of spread them far and wide, and this is just such a special opportunity to sort of memorialize that snapshot in time. And like we've sort of touched on already, there has been a lot of change, and you sort of forget in a way how you felt during that time and what that impact was. So I think it's so important to sort of give it that the space that it really deserves, to really sort of know in children's words like how it was for them. But we did learn a lot as well. We learned a lot about the sort of resourcefulness and resilience of these children, we asked them how they were coping and what was happening, but we also asked them, you know, what would support you in this time? And when we thought about going back to school, what would help you when you go back to school? And they had loads of ideas. They had loads and loads of ideas. A lot of them knew exactly what they would have needed for that to be a smoother transition for them. And we were able to sort of weave that into a lot of other pieces of work. So yeah, there was something really important then about just asking the questions, and there's so much for them to say, and for our job just being about listening and really raising those voices. And I'm so pleased. There's something feels really special about having all of their words and their views in a book now. And yeah, that, you know, it's quite concrete, isn't it, keeping it there forever now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what was on my mind to say, Kate, and I suppose I segue nicely on from you. We really wanted to know what the children and young people had to say, because it was so missing from the media at that point. And it felt really special that other people wanted to hear as well. So Chris approached us really early doors to put it into this book he was considering. The webinar we put out there has been viewed by thousands of people. We've gone on and done more research with EPs across the country. We've released blogs. We were invited to do some work with the NICE guidelines to update those. So everyone has wanted to hear what the children and young people told us and wanted to say. And I think that's incredibly powerful, and it puts a message out there to all children and young people that there are people out there that will listen to them and try to do something with what they share with us. And sometimes I think, you know, children and young people don't feel they have a voice, and we've shown in a little way that they do. So yeah, you know, in our chapter in the book, you know, we've literally got pages of just their quotes, exactly what they said to us. And I just think it's just amazing that that's always going to be there. So thank you, Chris, for letting us have that opportunity to share all of these children and young people's voices.
You're very welcome. And look, thanks for putting all that stuff together. It takes a lot more work than it does just to read the stuff. Look, writing is hard work. And thank you very much for your contribution. We've talked about the voice of the child. What about the voice of young mums, or maybe even mums? I'd like to introduce Abigail, who I'd quite like you to explain your family and where your children came in terms of the lockdown. And then perhaps we can have a chat about your experiences and what you feel the negative, and perhaps what you feel the positive things have been. Particularly, I know you've been very active in terms of helping young mums and young families through this extraordinary time. So Abigail, just remind us who you are, and remind us of your family and when they were born.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me to obviously write this chapter in the book. And I'm just in awe of everyone that's come before me this evening. So thank you so much. So as Chris said, my name's Abigail. I'm currently an early years educational psychologist. So an educational psychologist with a special interest in the early years. And I'm also a mum of 2 children, aged 2 and 5. So when the pandemic hit, my little girl was around 12 weeks old and I was on maternity at the time. And really, this was a huge motivation behind what led to this chapter, really. So at this time, there was lots of concern, obviously, raised in the media, lots of voices from parents and families about the concerns about the impact on their children's development and socialization at this stage, as well as missing out on those very early opportunities antenatally after giving birth, etc. And this concerned me too as well, because I think everyone's talked a lot about that awfulization that's been current throughout. And what really I wanted to try and promote was this idea of obviously it being a very individual experience for all, and that the pandemic wasn't this thing that directly impacted on child development, and it didn't have to inevitably lead to difficult consequences for children. And what I wanted to do was shift that focus, as we do as psychologists and people supporting families, often from the within child or within family to what was going on outside to help empower and support. So recognizing that everyone was going to experience this pandemic in very individual ways, and it wasn't necessarily going to be impacting on child development in the same way. So two things really was around kind of helping to empower parents in the first instance, focusing actually one of the key things within the early years is relationships and attachments. And if we can focus on getting those right in any context, that this can have a really positive effect later on in life. So I wanted to do a lot around that to say, okay, this big thing is happening and there are massive consequences for that and really sad and difficult ones for lots of people. But actually there is a lot of things that we can do within our context to still positively impact on child development, as well as sort of debunking some myths around things. So lots of questions that I had from friends, family, even the media, for instance, was around kind of the worry around, well, my child isn't able to socialize, so they're not going to develop socialization skills. This was kind of the myth. So even debunking some of these things around, well, in order to develop socialization skills, it can be done at home still. There's kind of this conception that unless they're out doing it with groups of children and other people, although that provides different opportunities for it, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be detrimental. So the other side of that then that I really wanted to highlight and was a concern for me is that this kind of challenge is going to be more likely for families, for contexts where things are already really challenging for them, and how we need to look at as a society, with policy, with communities, etc., supporting the context for people to enable everyone to thrive the best they can as well. So also trying to shine a light on those inequalities and how we can kind of counteract those as well. So the chapter itself then is quite a practical chapter. It touches on the experience of the early years, how important child development is within the early years, and it's quite a hopeful place to be and work and support, because really we're setting the future through that. But it's also highlighting that individual experience for families as well. So how this will be different for everyone. What we can do is focus on our relationships and our attachments. And there's lots of practical sort of tips then that follows, because this was something else that was really important to me, like lots of people have touched on with psychology, the importance of making psychology accessible and giving it away. And for those that might already know me, I spent quite a lot of time in lockdown creating sort of visual infographics that we could put out to families with key psychology messages and tips, etc. I started a little blog called Psych Mum, which is still quite in its infancy, but on social media. So some of the infographics then in the chapter also touch on some of the ideas that I tried to illustrate around Rothenberger's ecological systems theory and make that a little bit more accessible, as well as sort of what Richard touched on earlier around emotion coaching and like a framework for kind of supporting children in the moment as well. So I hope that summarised a little bit about my chapter. I'm really conscious of time. I was going to read a little bit out, but I'm really conscious that we're nearly towards the end. And I just want to thank everyone. Personally, I never thought I'd write a chapter. So I've got lots of people, including Chris, of course, for even thinking it would be possible for me, but lots of colleagues, obviously my own children and family, and I think my mum is even in the audience. So I have to give a little bit of a shout out for being top proofreader as well, as always. So thank you, Chris.
Oh, look, thank you, Abby. That's lovely. And your chapter is very, very approachable. I think it'll be a nice resource for many parents. Our last two contributions are not in person. And I'd like to introduce kind of remotely Elizabeth Roberts and Stephanie Severiano. Stephanie is a colleague of mine at the Tavistock, and she's talking about the neuropsychology of lockdown. And she's contributed some slides and an audio commentary. I'm hoping, Sarah, we can get those up. Are you there?
Hello, and thank you for coming today. We're sorry that we can't be there in person. Here is a small introduction to us, our chapter, and what it was like to collaborate on it. First, to introduce you to my co-author, Dr. Stephanie Santariano, who you can see a picture of there on the screen. Steffi is an educational psychologist and paediatric neuropsychologist. She's worked at St Thomas's Hospital in Children's Neurosciences and also at an inner London local authority educational psychology service. She is Secretary of the BPS Faculty of Paediatric Neuropsychology and a clinical tutor and research supervisor on the Tavistock and Portman Doctorate in Child, Educational and Community Psychology. I'm Liz Roberts. I'm the other picture on there. I'm an educational psychologist who has undertaken additional training in paediatric neuropsychology. I work at the Children's Trust, which is a residential neurorehabilitation setting for children and young people with acquired brain injury. I also have experience working for an inner London local authority educational psychology service like Steffi, providing psychological advice to a range of education settings. Our chapter is titled A Neuropsychological Lens on the Impact of Lockdown on Children and Young People. Within the chapter, we use a theoretical framework called the Interactive Specialization Framework. We use this to help us begin to think about the impact of the pandemic on children and young people from a neuropsychological perspective. For those who aren't familiar with it, the Interactive Specialization Framework proposes a bi-directional relationship between predisposing within child factors, the quality of the environment, and brain development. It also proposes that this process is dynamic, with some relationships having a varying effect depending on which stage the child or young person is at in terms of their development. Within this structure, we explore a range of predisposing and environmental factors, and a snapshot of these can be seen on the screen. We think about these factors in relation to how they may affect young people's outcomes in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We then go on to tentatively think about ways forward in light of this. Just finally then, a few words about what it was like to collaborate on this chapter. There were several things that we particularly found useful. Being able to think about such a new and unsettling issue in light of a more familiar framework was really useful in terms of being able to structure our thinking and begin to explore ways forward. Steffi and I are also from different backgrounds, bringing different experiences to the chapter, and I certainly found that two halves equated to more than a whole. Last, but by definitely no means least, having an opportunity to work together at a time when so much joint working was put on hold due to the pandemic was a real privilege. And so we would just like to say a big thank you for that opportunity. It was also a privilege to be part of this book amongst so many other skilled professionals and academics and so many interesting chapters. All that leaves me to say is thank you for listening, and we hope you both enjoyed the book and our chapter within it.
Thank you both. Our final contribution comes from the West Midlands and also from Italy. I mentioned at the beginning that I had 3 conversations with parents who all had interesting stories to tell about the experience of lockdown with different children. Well, this is the third one. And I'd like to introduce Amy Webster. Amy Webster is an educational psychologist working in Sandwell, but her source material comes from a lady called Stefania Donati, who lives in a place called Senigallia by the sea on the Adriatic. And she has 2 children, one of whom has Down syndrome. He's aged about 18 or 19 now, and the other is younger and has no condition. But the surprise for this particular family was that I anticipated the young man with Down syndrome, who is really can be really quite challenging and difficult, that I anticipated that the difficulties would be magnified with lockdown, and I was wrong. This young man actually took to lockdown extremely easily, in many ways more easily than his younger brother. However, when it came to the summer holiday time, and the summer holidays in Italy are about 3 months, that is when he started to have meltdowns and get extremely distressed. So I felt there was an interesting story here to tell. And Amy collaborated with Stefania to do this. There are 3 slides that I want to share with you. These are all prepared by Amy. But the chapter does set out some of the positive experiences that the lockdown created. And I know the flat that they are locked down in, it is fairly small. It's not a generous, it's got no garden, and Italy was actually in many ways stricter with lockdowns than we were. So you can see the slide there, and I'll give you a second to go through it. But it is in many ways a very positive message. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. The second relates to the support that can and should be offered. And I think the first bullet point, the following we use to illustrate the point, it is incredibly important. And we're facing that now in a number of settings, with people becoming quite anxious about going back, for example, to face-to-face teaching in a university. And I was again surprised to find this this to be the case. But in many ways, when you start to think about it, this is predictable. Staying at home is really quite safe. It's very it should be a nice safe space. Going out to an office, going out to a university, that can involve risks, and those maybe are going to be more challenging than the risks of going into lockdown. Can we have the third slide, please? Okay. This is basically a thank you slide from Amy. I again commend to you her chapter. It reflects experiences from Italy with quite a different culture towards children from our own. Both are very caring. Stefania is a teacher. She's well experienced as both a mother and a teacher, and she was the third one whose story triggered me to say, actually, let's put this book together. So I think that's us done. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Don't forget the discount code, Lockdown25. I'd like now to hand back to Sarah Sivers, who convened this. And Sarah, thank you so much for putting this together. You make it look so seamless. I'm terrified of this kind of technology, as I'm sure you've gathered. So thank you so much for putting this together. And I look forward to a future collaboration, if that's appropriate. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. And I suppose on behalf of all the authors, really, I would just like to sort of thank you and Brian and Karnak for inviting us along to contribute to this book. It's been a real privilege, and I think people have heard that through the stories we've shared about our chapters today, and it's been an honour to have you on EP Reach Out to launch this brilliant book. So thank you all so much for listening and staying with us. And yeah, we hope to link up with you all again soon. Thank you.
Can we all turn our videos on?
Everyone come on and say goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.